Okay, here we are again. Today is Thursday. I don't know the date, I can't remember that, but it's Thursday. Oh, the 16th. Thursday the 16th of April already. And this is the class in Romans 1 through 8, just the first half of Romans. Romans actually can be divided up into four chapters, four sections, four chapters each, 1 through 4, 8, 5 through 8, and so forth. But anyway, we are working towards the sin nature and humanity. We'll get to that in chapter 5 or whatnot, but in order to get to there, we're laying the foundation here, which is really a good foundation. We're fixing to get into the section here that is dealing with humanity and its degradation and its progress downward, and it's about as low as it can get here. We're starting with verse 18, and we have, again, it's about the gospel. Again, Paul is laying universal foundation here, right, was where we're headed, to establish the fact in verses 2, 3, and 4 in there that all men are guilty as all get out. There's no hope for them. They are sinful, and it's not by works, but it's by faith, and it's going to set this up. But first of all, he's laying the foundation that everybody's guilty. So if you claim not to be a sinner, you're wrong, because you are. That is that inner nature. We'll, of course, get to that later. And people don't like to hear that, and I realize that we're saved and born again, but nonetheless, it's in there. So Paul starts out with the gospel. A couple things we've learned about the gospel. One, it refers to the birth of an heir to a kingdom. If it's Caesar's son, it is good news because it says that the kingdom is going to keep going. But eventually, because it's a man's kingdom, it's going to fall. This gospel is the gospel of God and not the gospel of Caesar. If it's the son of somebody else, they're going to die and it's no good. The gospel of God is eternal. So the heir of the kingdom here is Jesus, and the key factor is whose heir is it, whose gospel is it? It's God. Secondly, it's the birth of a son, an heir to the eternal kingdom. And we know that person is Jesus Christ later. It's about him. We know the prophets talked about it. We know that he became the son of David according to the flesh. And he was marked out as the son of God from a spirit of holiness out of the resurrection from the dead. So we have humanity and resurrection. We have humanity and eternity, if you will. And in him was the seed of life, etc. We know here in verses 16 and 17, the gospel was the power of God. We talked about that last time. And that in that gospel we see the right actions of God, out of faith into faith, out of faith into faith, out of faith into faith, out of faith into faith. God acted rightly to humanity. Remember, God is righteous because he is faithful to his promise and the covenant. We got all that out of there so far. God is faithful to the promise and the covenant. Now, up until verse 17, Paul is laying that out. There is a way. There is a right way. There is a good way, and God has done it. And he's laying out that God has provided this for humanity. That's there. So he's given us the good news. First, the good news. The good news is that there's a hope. The good news is there's a gospel. The good news is we can be redeemed. Now we're getting the bad news. Verses 18 to the end of the chapter is going to be some bad news, and we're going to concentrate on some of that bad news, if you will. One other point here. Now we'll just leave that point here. Here's what it says, Romans 1:18. It says, the wrath of God, and it begins with the word for. Begins with the word for, which is a causal clause. A causal clause is telling us, it can be translated as because, it's translated as for. For is causal, but not as causal as a dia or something else. It says this, the wrath of God is being unpacked, is the way I would translate it, from heaven upon every act of ungodliness and every act of unrighteousness of men, and goes on. Now let's just go that far here. We've got to understand what this is. The passive voice being revealed or manifested, I refer to it as unpacking. Unpacking is a good way of looking at it. When we move, I used to have a mug collection. and when we would move, I would wrap each mug in a paper and pack it in a box. And when we got to where we're going, we'd unpack that, and I would. By the time we got there, I'd forgotten what all was, and so it was like opening Christmas presents when I unpacked them and stood them up on the shelf. I'd unpack one and said, "Oh, look at this one. I remember this. I unpacked this carefully, and it's of course Ohio State mug there." And on they would go. That's what unpacking is. I took my time because I enjoyed each one of those. Well, that's what this kind of unpacking is. It's the same word for the book of Revelation, and it's the same one that means that the earth moans and groans for the unpacking of the sons of God. And if I get going on that, we'll eat up all our time on that, so I can't. But we'll get to that. It's in Romans as well, so we'll get to it here. So, the wrath of God is being unpacked bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. Present tense. This is not in the future, it's now. Right now, as we are living and breathing via this Facebook Live, God's wrath is being unpacked bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. Revealed, unpacked. It's a passive voice, meaning that nobody can control it, that it is not doing it itself. It's not doing it itself. There's something acting on it that causes that to happen. Now don't pass over that. It is something that's happening to it, a passive voice. It's like the wrath of God is not initiating this. Something is initiating it. And we're going to define wrath in a minute. Something else is initiating it. This is a passive voice being unpacked. Again, pay attention to that something else is initiating it, all right? And here, let me say this. God, when he created this entire universe, I've said it before on here, I'll say it again, and I'll say it some more, created it according to rightness, according to right principle, according to goodness, eternal rightness, all right? And it's created the whole creation that way, humanity as well, until humanity actively engaged in falling away and in rebellion against God, and humanity fell, which subjugated, and we'll get to this in Romans 8:2, subjugated creation to futility, the picture is that the creation was not complicit in that. It didn't voluntarily do that. It was made to do it. And they made to do it out because of the act of man's sin. Now, here's what we're saying here. The wrath of God is being unpacked. There's something acting on that wrath of God. Think of that wrath of God, which really is the anger of God. The anger of God, think of that as something happening to it to cause it to be manifest. To bit by bit by bit, there's something happening. The question is, what is that is happening? You understand? God created this whole fabric of creation with, the eternal principle of goodness and rightness. Now, here's the point. Even creation senses evil, is what I'm saying. And we can validate the earth groans for the revealing of the sons of man. Jesus said that these people don't praise me, these rocks will cry out. I don't think that was just metaphorical or figuratively. I think it really would have happened. So God has created this universe, in a sense, with more sense than what humanity has. In other words, when things go goofy, when things go wrong, and sin goes rampant, and evil is all over the place, and perversion and all of that, it is running counter with the attitude and the purpose and the whole intrinsic dynamic that God created, the entire created order, and that created order revulses against that evil and that perversion and that degradation and that sin. Are you getting it? It happens of its own accord. It causes its own demise. Now, that's what's happening here. If you water around in rock and filth and this and that, you're going to get sick. If you mess around and live with that, you're going to get sick. The natural things they have a natural result, and that's what we're saying here. Now, this wrath of God is the word orge, O-R-G-E would be an English equivalent here. And another word that's translated somewhat the same is thumos, T-H-U-M-O-S, English transliteration. Now, normally, orge is translated anger, and the idea, and it can be translated wrath, but there is a differentiation between those two words of orge and thumos. Orge is a lesser one, thumos is more severe. Let me explain it. Orge, I think we get the word orgy from there, and it'll tell you kind of what it means. But orge refers to a long settled disposition. You see, God created the whole of creation with a long settled disposition and a bent towards good and righteousness. Wasn't created for all the rot and the filth that humanity has let happen from Satan through it on this world. It wasn't created for that, and it knows it's off, if you will. So God has a long settled disposition towards sin and towards unrighteousness. The orge, that word is here, is be a good illustration of that would be to look at a volcano before it blows up. It's seething underneath it. It's anger. It's bubbling up here and there. It's just being disturbed all over the place. And pretty soon that pressure is going to mount and kaboom! The volcano explodes. Well, this is not the explosion. This is the long settled bubbling disposition. It's on the inside. It's agitated. Its inside is agitated. The sin and the perversion, all that is agitating this. You understand? It's getting all worked up, and that has to find a release, or it will explode. Now, one day it's going to blow, and that's when the word thumos comes at the end of the age. But we're not there yet, and this word isn't that. So here we're saying, there is a long settled disposition of God towards the perversion and the sin and the degradation in this world. Long settled disposition. It doesn't mean that God's going around talking nasty about it and all this kind of nonsense. That's not it. It's just that's what it is. And God, that cannot penetrate God. God cannot let the perversion and the sin and the rot and the filth it all penetrate him or his kingdom. It can't penetrate him. It is of a nature that is the absolute opposite antithesis to the nature of the kingdom and the nature of God. It cannot penetrate that. Call that the wrath of God or the anger of God in this text. Now that disposition of God toward that perversion that can't get through, when that perversion can't get through to God and find acceptance, it gets angry. It gets mad. We're seeing that in this country today. The real target of these angry people is not the president, it's God. It's really God. They're really mad at God. They're really upset with God because God simply cannot approve of the perversion and all the corruption. Can't do it regardless of where it's from. And it can't penetrate that, and that gets evil even madder and madder and madder. So actually it does itself in. I hope that makes sense to you. But it's the anger of God. The anger of God is being unpacked little by little by little. And it intensifies every time. The reason it intensifies every time is because the evil can't find acceptance, it gets more evil. Maybe more evil. If we get more evil, maybe it'll find acceptance. And that doesn't. And so it just exacerbates itself. Now where is this coming from? It's coming from heaven. Apah, from heaven, is the source of this. Well, that's where God is. That's where God's righteousness and character and his nature, that's where he is. So it's coming from there. Whatever is activating this is coming from there. The unpacking and the unpacking and the unveiling is coming from there. Listen, it's like this. It's like overcome evil with goodness. Remember that verse? How in the world do you do that? It's hard to do that. It costs you, if you're going to be good, to overcome evil, because look, goodness is good to evil. When goodness is good towards those who are evil, expresses goodness, what does that do? It exposes the inner core of the evil and the perversion. That's what's going on around us too. The goodness and the rightness and the justice of God is exposing all of the rotten inner core of evil. and perversion, exposes it, brings light to it, and that even makes it worse. And the persecution becomes exacerbated because of that. But that's how it works. That's how it becomes better. Okay. It says, from heaven, that's the source of it, and it's upon every act of ungodliness. The word upon is epi. It means over and upon. Shirley, what are you wanting to tell me? She's saying I'm getting too loud. I need to shut up. Okay? I'll quiet down here. That's what I need to do. It is upon every act of ungodliness and every act of unrighteousness. I have a tendency to get excited and to let it go, and sometimes it can sound like what you're aggravated or mad. Well, sometimes you do become aggravated, and sometimes it sounds like that. It doesn't mean I don't mean that, so I'll have to learn to control myself and pull myself down some. Every act of ungodliness. What are we talking about? Every act of ungodliness. Ungodliness refers to anything that's not godly. Actually, it really refers to a rejection of everything that God is. It refers to rejecting what God is, and unrighteousness. Every act of unrighteousness, that refers to everything that isn't right, and the source of that is coming from man. So his disposition against that is against every act of ungodliness and every act of unrighteousness is against the men who do that. Now, this is against men, humanity. And here's a description of humanity. The humanity is described as the ones who attempt to hold down the truth in unrighteousness. To holding down the truth in unrighteousness. What in the world does that mean? The holding down is the key element here. Combination of a couple words. The first word is to have. In other words, to possess. We possess something. I have something. Now, the idea is this, that this humanity has truth. In this country and in the world, truth is out there. It's been taught, it's been preached, it's been practiced. It's out there. Truth is out there. So it's not that there isn't any truth. The truth is there, and this is telling us that they know that it's there. What it tells us then is that these people who are trying to suppress it, they know what the truth is. They know that it's true, and they know they are false. Keep that in mind as we work through what's going on with us, and especially in this country and elsewhere, that those perpetrators know really what's true and false. They choose the false while they know the truth, and they know what that truth is. They are against that truth, and they've rejected that truth, so they cannot support that truth. They have to hold that truth down. And that preposition and prefix there means to restrict and to push down and to hold it down. What they're wanting to do is they recognize the fact that truth is. This is it. They recognize the fact that truth is and what it is. They are absolutely, totally opposed to it and hate it. So the only thing they can do is suppress it and do everything they can do to keep it quiet. That's what this is talking about. Their means of doing that is by doing unright things, doing unrighteousness things, things that aren't godly, things that are evil, and they know that it is. That's what's happening here. So what do we have so far? We have that the anger of God is being unpacked bit by bit by bit by bit from heaven upon every act of ungodliness and every act of every unright act. That is the point there is the singularity of this individual. It's not all of it as a whole hunk. It's every individual act of unrightness and unrighteousness. Every individual act has its own unpacking of its evil. And boy, when you put all of those acts together, you got a real mess there. Now, of who is doing that? It says of humanity. What kind of humanity? The humanity that recognizes there is a truth, and they have to recognize it because it's a truth, but they hate it, and they have made a decision to be against it, so they reject it. And the only way they can keep from being, say, convicted of it or whatever, is to suppress it, hold it down, wipe it out, try to destroy its source, and hold it down, hold it in check. That's the battle that's really going on today. Now, there is a causal statement in verse 19. This causal statement is different than the former one, up in verse 18, where it says, for the wrath of God, following the two verses that come before it. This one in verse 19 is dioti. It is a combination of two words that can introduce causal clauses, and both of them are different than the one that was in 18. When you contract them and put them together, combine them, it is an emphatic causal statement here. So this gives us the ground and the basis for what was just said in verse 18 here. And this is the basis. This is why. This is the foundation upon which which God's anger is being unpacked. This is the reason why it can be unpacked. This is the ground. This is the standing upon which it has. All right? And that's this. That the knowledge of God, in other words, that which can be known about God. There's nobody can know everything and all things about God. That you can't do. We can know some things, and we can know a lot of things. And God, it says here that that which can be known of God has been manifested in them. Them referring to the humanity we just had in verse 18. So we're talking about humanity. Okay, get this, that which can be known of God has been manifested inside of humanity. Not outside of humanity too, but inside humanity here. The preposition is in. It means in. It's in us. There's something in humanity that testifies, that knows that there is a God. That which is knowable of God has been manifested in man. This word manifest is, it does not refer to a piece by piece by piece by piece by piece. It refers to all at once, in one shot, it's there. It's like this. If you go into a room and it's dark and you turn the light switch on, the light comes on, right now it's lit up. The room is lit up. That's what this means. So what it's saying here is that which can be known of God has been lit up on the inside of them. On the inside of them, it's there. You might refer to it somewhat, not totally, but somewhat, as the light on the inside. Don't mean that literally, but it's a way of explaining this. It says has been manifested in them. How is that possible? How did that happen? God says this, Paul says this, that because, or for, that's the lighter word, for God has manifested it to them. Are you getting this? God has manifested it to them. All of a sudden, the light came on, it's manifested to them, and on that basis, it's manifested in them. There are two ways here. It's on the inside, because God manifested it to them. To them. When something is manifested to you, you perceive it on the inside. You see it on the inside. So it's on the inside. The fact that it's on the inside is a real stubborn witness to the truth. Let me tell you, in all of humanity, doesn't matter what they are, who they are, where they come from, what religion it is, there is a real stubborn thing deep on the inside of humanity that was created in there by God, and that is this, that which can be known of God has been manifested to them, therefore it is manifest in them. Something on the inside that cannot shake that loose for all that they do. It cannot shake it loose. Satan can't shake it loose either. He knows he's a cooked goose, if you will. He knows that. He can't shake himself from that. Okay. Now, God manifested it to them. And this is talking about the invisible things of God from the beginning of creation of the world are being clearly seen even today. You can see, and that's referring to the created order now. We can see all the created order. And in seeing the created order here, we can rationalize on the inside, we can perceive of the greatness that it is, and that which God put on the inside tells us that's God's created order. And yet humanity rejects that. And it says here that all of that is seen and clearly understood by the things that God has created. We call that natural revelation, by the way, by the things that God has created. Even the invisible things, the eternal things of God, His divinity, His Godhead, all that He is, His power, and all that, resulting in this, that humanity has no excuse. The word for this is apology. It's not that man is going to apologize for his evil. That doesn't what this word means. It means to give an account, to give a defense, really. Man has no defense. And the idea here, there's no amount of discourse or saying that man can come up with that can justify his position. He doesn't have a position. The one little particle prefix here means the opposite of being able to have that. It is destroyed. That little particle destroys any hope whatsoever of humanity ever to be able to draw any kind of a rational reason why it is what it is. It can't do it. It can't do that from anywhere, any source. Humanity is stark raving crazy. There's no way can it defend itself to God or give God an excuse for this. Verse 21. Because this is an emphatic because. The reason why we have that phrase above it is because of verse 21. He says this. There are two participles here. One participle here, and then two main verbs and a participle on down the road. Here, after knowing God is the idea here. Sometimes it can be translated as while knowing God, but it's not a while knowing God. Although in one sense it is. But the tense here is an aorist, which means, of course, refers to as something that's happened. So it's after they had known God, and you could say in one sense, when they did know God. You could put it that way, is better than while. When they did know God here, this is what what humanity ceased to do. This is what we got to watch out for. When they knew God, humanity, one, stopped glorifying God as God, and two, they stopped thanking God as God. That's what humanity did. Humanity did two things. One, they stopped glorifying God as God, and two, they stopped thanking God as God. Now, what does it mean to glorify God? The word glory refers to God's presence. How in the world is it that we as humanity can glorify God? How can we make God any more present than He is? What kind of influence can we have towards God on that? The meaning of that is this. When humanity did know God, they stopped allowing God's presence in them. If you apply that to a church gathering is like this then. When they knew God, they stopped allowing the presence of God to be active in their congregations. When they knew God, they stopped allowing God's presence to be present in school, in the political scene, in all the civil places in the entire country, everywhere. They stopped allowing God's presence to be welcomed, and they stopped allowing the freedom of God's presence in the place. That's what's happening here. When they stop that, something else takes place. We got to notice that. Then it says they stopped thanking God as their God, as the God of things. Now, this grateful heart is a very important thing. I remember I learned something from Pastor Richard McLean years ago. I noticed when I was with him a lot. We did a lot together, a long, long time ago. And I noticed he always would say, thank you. Oh, thank you. Or thank you. To people for whom he had just done something. Thank you. I never mentioned this to him at all, but I noticed it. Thank you. He would thank me when he would give me something, or he was helping me with the vehicle or something. And then he would say, thank you. I learned that from him. Thank you. Always have a thankful heart. Thankfulness. We enter His court with thanksgiving and praise. We come into the presence of God that way. So thanksgiving. When humanity stopped being thankful to God for everything that they had and for their supply and for giving them this great country, the United States of America, when the church quits thanking God for this great country to live in and to proclaim the gospel, from which to proclaim the gospel all around the world, when humanity stops thanking God, something happens. And this is what happens here. He says, when they knew God, they stopped allowing God's presence to be active and free, and they quit thanking God as the God of their source and sustenance and perseverance. And when that happened, it says, they became stupid. They became foolish. They became empty. They became futile, would be one translation here. It means they have no base, no ground of operation, no foundation. When humanity stopped allowing God's presence, when humanity stopped thanking God as God, their foundation of existence ceased. Their base of operation, they have nothing to stand upon. They have no standing. They are groundless. They have no foundation. They are floating out there somewhere. And it says they became that way in their philosophy, in their reasoning, in their logic. Well, later on when we get down here, that's going to really come out in verse 28. But here, they became empty, groundless in their reasoning, in their rationale, in their thinking through and processing facts and truth, not able to come to a right conclusion, a right summation of it all. That has to do with reasoning. Well, we see that today. I've never seen things so. They don't understand. Wow. Somebody will say something. You think, well, where in the world did that come from? They can't. There's no amount of reason can reason with something that reason didn't put in to begin with. It's crazy. That's what it is. They became futile, basically groundless. It makes no sense. And he says, their knowledge-less heart became darkened. The word knowledge-less here means reckless, but it's more than that. It means that their heart turned away from God, and when it turned away from God and quit allowing God's presence and quit thanking God for God in their life, they could no longer perceive right from wrong. This has to do with their thinking process. They could not comprehend. They could not perceive. They had no more judgment between truth and wrong and falsehood. What's right and wrong. What's truth and what's false. No discernment. They can't tell. You can tell them a flat truth and they refuse it. They could not. They have, and this is where they are. There's no way they can tell it. It's impossible for them to discern between right and wrong and truth and falsehood. They cannot recognize the truth for what it is. And by the way, when you think on that, it said the Bible tells us that Jesus is the truth. And when they get to that level, it would indicate maybe they can't even reason. They can't even see him. Certainly they can't reason that. They can't see him or recognize him when he's here. That could be very well true. So their heart, what is the heart? The core of their being. Whatever that is, the center core of their being became darkened. That's being darkened is the opposite of light. It's the opposite of light. It's the opposite of righteous. It's the opposite of right. It's the opposite of good. Darkness, you can't see. Think of a darkness in a room that is so dark you cannot even see anything. It's just dark. That's what it's saying of humanity in this world. That when all of what we talked about, their heart then became darkened. Their heart, first of all, got to a place where they couldn't discern between right and wrong, and then they became darkened, which means they can't see at all. And in that darkened state, in that blind state, Jesus talked about the blind leading the blind, and this is a picture of that. They were claiming, and this is a fallen humanity, we're seeing this in the country today, they're claiming to be wise. They're claiming to be wise. They're claiming to be wise men. They're claiming to know so much. about this. You know how you can become an expert in one thing, in one field, and these experts become expert to study it all their life to become knowing this and that, but they're so narrow in what they know that they are unreasonable for everything else. They're so narrow on what they know, they can't see the big picture. And when it comes time to decide what to do, all they think of is a narrow. No, we got to keep it like this. But to keep it like this is to destroy the whole mess beside it, and they cannot see that. They can only see that narrow scope. You understand? That's what this is talking about. That because when we get to know so much, they become foolish. Claiming to be wise, it says here, they became fools. The word for this is moron. We could get a moron from this, but the word means to be senselessly wicked. Wow. Claiming to be wise, they became senselessly wicked and took on the character of a fool, it says here. And then they get to this. This is not the final rung. We're going to see several rungs come down this ladder here. And starting the next time we meet together, we're going to see some of those. I don't think we'll get to all of them. In verse 23 it says that that's probably translated in your translation that they exchanged the presence or the glory of an incorruptible God for those of something else. We'll get to that in a second here. The word exchange or exchange, I don't know exactly. I don't know what the English translation says, but what it means is this. While at one time they had, for example, over here you would have God, and this pictures the whole thing. And then you have humanity. I'll just put man for short. I'll put H, human. Humanity here, all right. And then you've got the natural created order here over this way. This is what this is saying here. Humanity used to allow God in. They used to welcome God's presence, but now humanity doesn't. They used to be thankful to God for His presence. Now they're not thankful to God for anything. And we just went through what happened. Their heart, senseless, stupid heart became darkened, and all of this and that and the other. So what it is saying then here is that what they did is, here's what it means to exchange. They stopped looking this way and began to look this way. They turned right around. And so they cut God off here. They rejected God and put a barrier. Rejected Him totally. Now let me ask you, don't you see that as having happened in this world? Indeed, in this country already in many places? God has been rejected. They've exchanged that. They've turned that in. They didn't exchange it. They canceled it. The word here that's translated that means, it can be used to describe a divorce, actually. In other words, they divorced God and married another, is what we're saying here. And that's what Israel did in the Old Testament too, and God calls that prostitution, by the way. Idolatry and prostitution. So they reject God and they go the natural order. What kind of a God did they reject? One that's incorruptible. One that cannot fade away. One that cannot rust. One that cannot be influenced by evil or perversion or sin. A God that is eternally God, all-powerful, all-being. That's what they rejected. A God that's solid and sure. A God that doesn't change. An incorruptible God. And this is what they went to instead. They turned to that and went to this. An image in the likeness of corruptible. That which can be corrupted. There's a lot. There's a lot in the world that's corrupted, isn't it? And corruptible. I mean, just look around at what's happening all around us. You talk about corruption, there's not an instrument created anywhere that can measure how much of it is. But this is what humanity has done. Turned from God and turned to corruptible stuff as their God. This corruptible stuff is their God now. It is corruptible, the corruption of men, other men they worship. And it's made, these things are made in the image of birds, four-footed beasts, and reptiles. What's being said here is they worship the creation now instead of the Creator. They worship the animals instead of the Creator. In fact, humanity is derided as being the main problem in this world. I mean, pollution and all that, Greenpeace, all that nonsense, which really isn't there. Man does have a whole lot of problems and has rejected God, but that's a whole lot different. That's not this. So they have rejected God and moved towards nature and towards man, towards humanity, the corruptible stuff. And man, we could talk for that. So in verse 24, and I'm not going to go here, but I want to introduce this for next time. Therefore, and it's not a therefore in verse 24, it's a wherefore. There is a word translated therefore, and there's a word translated wherefore. A therefore and a wherefore. A therefore is less powerful. A wherefore is, that's there. A therefore is sort of a resultant thing, and because of that, then this, in a sense. A wherefore, though, is more emphatic and more dynamic. And it says here, and I'm going to close with this, wherefore God delivered them over to their own lusts. The picture here is a God taking them by the hand, coming along beside them, and giving them over to their own desires, to their own lusts, is what it be translated, to their own perversion. It's a picture of this. Humanity that God created in His own image and likeness. God has great thing in store for that. He had a great plan. Still does. It's still there. But that which God intended for it to be, it rejected way back, and still rejects it now even more powerfully than it originally did. And they are insisting, humanity is insisting on all the filth and the perversion and the rot. All of the lusts, all the desires of this, that, all of that. And here's, God created humanity with a free will and a choice. God is not going to violate that free will or choice. You can choose to love God or choose not to love God. You can choose to hate God. You can choose to surrender to the Lord or choose to reject Him. God does not coerce people to come to Him. He does not demand or make them. Love does not do that. You understand? Real love from God, real agape love, gives humanity created in the image and likeness of God freedom to choose. And so respectful is God of your choice to choose Him or reject Him, to love Him or hate Him, to want to be with Him or to want to throw Him out, to want nothing to do with His presence, not allow, He's not welcome here, and we're not thanking Him, we don't believe in Him, we don't want Him. Painfully, I'll say, God allows that. I think with some, I don't know the word I want, from grief, and so God talks sometimes about how He is grieved with human choice. But there's coming a time, and it's very close right now, that those who have rejected God and don't love Him and want nothing to do and have booted Him out of every place, they're going to have their own place to go that God created for them, because He is respecting their choice to reject Him for eternity. They're rejecting light, they're rejecting righteousness, they're rejecting the only one who really loves them. They're rejecting that, and they are stubbornly rejecting that. So God has made a place for them to go for eternity away from Him, to be isolated in outer darkness away from God for eternity. But those who choose to love Him, God has created an incredible eternity for them. That's the picture here. That's the picture. If humanity persists in its perversion, in its ungodliness, God's going to give it on over. He's going to let them have it. He's going to let them have it. He's not going to fuss with them, but don't worry, it cannot penetrate God. The anger of God, the disposition of God against all of that, all of that cannot penetrate who and what God is. It can't get through there, which makes it even matter. But with that persistence, God gives them over. There are 3 instances in the next paragraph of God doing this. The exact wording in the Greek text is the same. God gave them over. God gave them order. And in verse 28, there is a final giving over. we're going to close it with this. I don't know who's watching or who's listening, or I don't know any of that. I know there's some former students all over the place, and in the Philippines and Australia and in Jamaica and Curacao and other places, and then across the country too. So I don't know, but let me tell you, if you're watching this and you have made a decision to reject God, you have nothing to do with him. Not to leave, you want to leave him out of everything. Boy, you need to think that over. You need to change your mind. That's the meaning of the word repentance. You need to change your mind and turn to Jesus. He's the only one, I'm telling you, the only one that is going to see you through this mess that we are in, not just in this country, but in the entire world. That'll be all we have for today. I'm thinking on we're doing another one of these tomorrow to start in on that last paragraph. I'm not sure, but I know we got a long ways to go. I hope you're enjoying this. I'm taking this as though it were a graduate level class, actually, though a seminary class, coming right out of the Greek text in Romans 1 through 8. Anyway, our prayers are with you. Let's pray for one another. Let's talk to God about everything. Let him talk to us. And you have a good rest of the day and the rest of the week. God is with us. We'll see you next time. Thank you.